Family reunion, they presented me with a cake that read biggest disappointment. Laughter erupted around me, and I managed to smile as I pulled out my laptop, turning it around to reveal what was on the screen. My mother fainted at the sight of what I had uncovered about our family's darkest secret. I had sensed something was amiss the moment I drove into my parents' driveway. The annual Thompson family reunion was in full swing, the expansive property filled with luxury vehicles, rental cars, and the occasional sensible sedan belonging to the few relatives who hadn't bought into the family myth of necessary extravagance. Colorful balloons danced in the late August breeze, and a hand-painted banner strung between two oak trees proclaimed Thompson Family Reunion 2023 in my mother's immaculate calligraphy. Everything appeared normal, picture-perfect, even, and that was precisely what made my stomach twist into knots. In the Thompson family, perfection was a warning sign, a carefully constructed facade meant to distract from what lurked beneath. I lingered in my car for a moment longer, watching through the windshield as relatives mingled on the manicured lawn. Aunt Linda was gesturing animatedly as she recounted some story to a circle of captivated cousins. Uncle George was manning the grill with mathematical precision, spatula in one hand and timer in the other. My sister Emma's children, perfect little replicas of their mother, were chasing each other around the garden fountain. I checked my watch, 4:17 p.m. I was 17 minutes late, which meant my mother had already noted my absence and had likely commented on it to anyone within earshot. Always running on his own schedule, she'd say with that tight smile, ever since he was a little boy. What she wouldn't mention was that I had been stuck in a 3-hour meeting with the FBI's cybersecurity division, helping them trace a ransomware attack on a major hospital network. Such achievements didn't fit the narrative she had crafted about her disappointing younger child, so they simply didn't exist in her version of reality. Finally, I stepped out of my car, grabbing the backpack from the passenger seat. It felt heavier than it should have, weighed down not just by my laptop but by what it contained: 6 months of investigation, countless sleepless nights, and the truth that would shatter the Thompson family's carefully constructed image forever. "There he is," my mother's voice cut through the ambient chatter as she spotted me walking up the path. Sarah Thompson, still elegant at 63, her silver-streaked blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon, hurried toward me with arms outstretched as if we were the kind of family that hugged with genuine affection rather than for the benefit of onlookers. "Happy birthday, darling," she exclaimed, embracing me briefly. She smelled of Chanel No. 5 and barely concealed disapproval. "We were beginning to think you'd forgotten." "Sorry, work emergency," I replied, the excuse both true and guaranteed to be dismissed on a Saturday. "That computer place works you too hard," she patted my cheek and lowered her voice. "And you could have worn something a bit nicer, it's a special occasion." I glanced down at my button-down shirt and dark jeans, perfectly appropriate attire by any reasonable standard, and nodded without arguing. There was no point. In 30 years, I'd never won an argument with Sarah Thompson. "Michael," my father's booming voice carried across the lawn as he approached, bourbon in hand. Despite the early hour, Richard Thompson had built his father's modest chemical company into a regional powerhouse through what he called good old-fashioned American ingenuity and what I now knew was criminal negligence and environmental destruction. He clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to make me wince. "The prodigal son returns." Before I could respond, Emma appeared as if summoned by some silent alarm that her moment in the family spotlight was being threatened. At 34, my sister had perfected our mother's elegant but approachable aesthetic, right down to the pearls at her throat and the calculating warmth in her smile. Finally, the birthday boy arrives. She threw her arms around me in a hug that felt more like performance than affection, then stepped back to assess me. "God, you look exhausted. Are you sleeping at all?" "I sleep fine," I lied, knowing that the dark circles under my eyes told a different story. The truth, that I had been awake until 3 a.m. finalizing the presentation now saved on my laptop, would only invite more questions I wasn't ready to answer. "Well, everyone's been waiting for you," Emma said, linking her arm through mine and steering me toward the gathered family members. "Mom's been planning this for months, you know." That was Emma's specialty, the casual guilt trip disguised as concern, the subtle reminder that my existence was an inconvenience to everyone else. I had spent most of my life believing table in front of me, the anticipation was palpable, not mine, but theirs. Something about their smiles seemed off. "Open it," Emma urged, her phone already out to capture my reaction. I lifted the lid and felt my stomach drop. There, in elegant blue frosting across a white cake, were the words "biggest disappointment," with my name underneath in smaller letters. For a moment, no one said anything. Then my cousin Jake snorted, and suddenly everyone was laughing, my father's deep chuckle, my mother's delicate giggle, Emma's theatrical howl. "Oh, lighten up," my mother said, noticing my expression. "It's just a joke. Everyone knows how unique your life choices have been." My father nodded in agreement. "You've always marched to your own drummer, son." "Yeah," Emma added, "most families have a black sheep, you're ours." More laughter erupted. I looked around at their smiling faces, my uncle wiping tears from his eyes, my nephews giggling, though they were too young to understand the joke, and my grandmother watching silently, her expression unreadable. In that moment, everything crystallized: the years of subtle digs and not-so-subtle exclusion, the constant comparison to Emma's conventional success, the dismissal of my achievements because they didn't fit the Thompson family template. The fundamental truth was that to them, I would always be the punchline. But today, the joke was about to backfire spectacularly. "You know what?" I said, my voice carrying across the sudden quiet. "You're right. I am a disappointment. I've never quite fit the Thompson family mold, have I?" My mother's smile faltered slightly. "Honey, it's just a joke." "I know," I replied, reaching for my backpack, which I had set beside my chair. "And I've got a pretty good one for you too." The laptop I pulled out wasn't my usual work computer. This was an older one I'd bought specifically for this project, one that couldn't be traced back to me. I opened it, entered the password, and turned the screen toward them. "What's this?" my father asked, squinting at the display. "Just a little presentation I put together," I said, clicking to start the slideshow about our family history. The first slide showed a newspaper clipping from 1978, a small-town paper with a headline about a fire at a chemical plant in Brookfield, a tiny town 60 miles from where we now sat. My father's expression shifted, the amusement draining from his face. "That's enough, son," he said sharply. I clicked to the next slide, revealing documents showing ownership of the plant, my grandfather's name, my father's name, inspection reports, safety violations highlighted in red, dates circled, signatures enlarged. "Michael, please," my mother whispered, her hand clutching her pearls. The next slide displayed medical records, cancer clusters in neighborhoods downwind of the plant, children with rare diseases, death certificates with causes redacted but later revealed through Freedom of Information requests, statistical analyses showing illness rates 400% higher than the national average. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Stop this right now," my father growled, stepping toward me. The next slide revealed internal memos I had found buried in digital archives and through carefully cultivated sources inside the company, warnings from scientists ignored, reports of contamination buried, testimonies from former employees who tried to speak up and were silenced, witnesses paid off or threatened. My mother swayed on her feet, and Emma was no longer smiling. Her perfect facade was cracking as she looked from me to our father and back again. I said stop. My father lunged for the laptop, but I pulled it back. "Why? It's just a joke, right? Like the cake?" I kept my voice steady. "Everyone knows how unique the Thompson family business practices have been." I clicked to the next slide, bank statements showing money transferred to offshore accounts, millions hidden while victims' families got nothing, political donations to officials who later blocked investigations, payments to medical experts who conveniently couldn't establish causation between the chemicals and the illnesses devastating Brookfield. "You have no idea what you're talking about," my father sputtered, his face turning red. "These are complex business matters you couldn't possibly understand." "Actually, I understand perfectly," I said, clicking to the next slide. I had spent 6 months understanding exactly how our family fortune was built. The screen now showed a detailed timeline connecting the Brookfield disaster to the Thompson Chemical Company's sudden expansion in the early 1980s, how my grandfather had used insurance money and legal settlements to buy out competitors, how my father had continued the practice of cutting corners on safety and environmental regulations, burying reports of contamination at 3 other facilities across 2 states. Relatives were murmuring now, some backing away as if the truth were contagious, others families who buried their children while we had birthday parties with custom cakes. Someone had revived my mother, who was now sitting in a patio chair, gulping water and sobbing. My father stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on me with a hatred I had never seen before. "You're no longer my son," he said, his voice cold. "You're dead to this family." "That's funny," I replied, because I felt dead to this family for as long as I can remember. "The only difference is now I know why." Emma stepped forward, her perfect makeup streaked with tears. "Do you have any idea what this will do to us? To my children? Their future?" "I thought about that," I admitted, but then I thought about all the children in Brookfield who didn't get a future at all. I walked toward the gate, then turned back one last time to address the stunned gathering. "Enjoy the cake. I hear disappointment tastes a lot like justice." As I walked away, I could hear the chaos behind me, shouting, crying, the sound of a family mythology crumbling to dust. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the biggest disappointment at the Thompson family reunion. I was just the only one who refused to keep pretending, and that made all the difference. The aftermath came swiftly. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone was already exploding with messages, texts from Emma alternating between rage and desperate pleading, voicemails from my father, his threats barely coherent through his fury, and a single text from my grandmother, "Arthur would be proud. The rest of us are ruined." I turned my phone off and sat in the darkness of my living room, both lighter and heavier than I had been in years. The first news story broke at 11 p.m. A developing investigation into historical environmental violations by Thompson Chemical Company. By morning, it was the leading story on every local channel. By noon the next day, it had gone national. I watched from a distance as my family's legacy imploded. Stock in what was now Thompson Industries fell 70% in 2 days. My father resigned as CEO to focus on addressing these historical allegations, according to the hastily issued press release. Emma's husband, who served as the company's chief financial officer, was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Reporters camped outside my parents' house, and former residents of Brookfield came forward with their stories, heartbreaking accounts of children who'd never reached adulthood, of cancer clusters that had devastated entire neighborhoods, of pleas for help that went ignored by officials in the Thompson family's pocket. 1 week after the reunion, I received a letter from a law firm representing my parents. They were disowning me, formally cutting me from their will, demanding I cease using the Thompson name. I signed the papers without hesitation and sent them back. The name had become a burden, and I was relieved to shed it. 2 weeks later, federal agents raided Thompson Industries headquarters. They carried out boxes of documents and hard drives, and 3 executives were led away in handcuffs, old men who had been with the company since my grandfather's day, who had helped build and maintain the wall of silence around Brookfield. A month after that, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. Rebecca, my father's younger sister, who had distanced herself from the family years ago and had been notably absent from every reunion I could remember. I had always heard she was troubled, another family disappointment who had chosen art over industry and had never amounted to much. "I knew someday this would come out," she said as she sat across from me, cradling a cup of coffee. "I just didn't think it would be you who did it." "Why not me?" I asked. She smiled sadly. "Because you were the good one. The quiet one who never made waves, the one who kept trying to earn their approval." "That wasn't goodness," I said. "That was cowardice." "Maybe at first," she conceded, "but what you did took courage." "Did you know about Brookfield?" I asked. She nodded slowly, not the details, but enough. "I confronted Dad about it once, back in the 90s. He told me I was being dramatic, that business required difficult decisions, that the greater good sometimes meant sacrifices." "The greater good?" I repeated bitterly. "That was always their justification," she said. "The family, the legacy, the greater good, as if those things existed separately from the lives they destroyed." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn envelope. "I brought you something from Great-Uncle Arthur." I took the envelope carefully. Inside was a faded photograph of a young man with my eyes and a serious expression, standing next to my much younger grandfather. On the back, in faded handwriting, it read, "James and Arthur Wilson, fund cleanup of the contaminated sites. They would establish a trust for victims and their families." It wasn't justice, not really. No amount of money could bring back the dead or heal those still suffering, But it was something, an acknowledgement, at least, that what had happened was real and wrong. I received no compensation, having voluntarily removed myself from the family assets. I returned to my job, to my quiet life, to the process of figuring out who I was without the weight of secrets and shame. On my 31st birthday, almost a year after the reunion, I received a package. Inside was a small cake, not elaborate or professionally decorated, just a simple chocolate cake with "Biggest Hero" written in slightly wobbly blue frosting. The note was from a woman in Brookfield. She had lost her daughter to leukemia in 1986 and had fought for decades to prove that Thompson Chemical was responsible. She had been dismissed as hysterical and attention-seeking by doctors and officials in my family's pocket. "Thank you," she had written, "for giving us back our truth." I ate a slice of the cake alone in my kitchen, thinking about family and legacy and the different ways we become who we are, about how sometimes the greatest act of loyalty isn't keeping secrets but exposing them, about how sometimes being a disappointment to the wrong people is the highest compliment. I didn't regret what I'd done, not when I read about the Thompson Industries bankruptcy filing, not when I saw my father's haggard face on television as he was indicted for conspiracy and fraud, not when I heard that my grandmother had died without ever acknowledging her role in the cover-up. The truth had cost me a family, but it had given me something more valuable, the knowledge that when faced with the choice between comfort and conscience, I had chosen correctly. I saved a piece of the Biggest Hero cake in my freezer, not to eat, but to remember, to remind myself that legacies aren't built on names or fortunes or what we manage to hide, they're built on the choices we make when no one else is watching, on whether, when tested, we become our best or worst selves. At the next family reunion, a small, quiet gathering with Aunt Rebecca and a few cousins who had reached out after breaking ties with my parents, I told the story of Great Uncle Arthur, of how he had seen what was happening and refused to be part of it, of how he had walked away and built a different kind of life. "Sometimes," Aunt Rebecca said, raising her glass, "disappointment is just integrity with bad PR." We laughed, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged, not to the Thompson name or legacy, but to something better, the tradition of those who choose truth over comfort, who refuse to be complicit, who recognize that family, real family, is built on love and honesty, not secrets and shame. And that was a legacy I could live with. 5 years passed quicker than I expected. The Thompson Industries scandal faded from national headlines, though in Brookfield and the other affected communities, the impact of my family's actions continued to shape daily life. The settlement money helped some families with medical bills and relocation costs, but no amount of compensation could truly make things right. I built a new life for myself. I left the cybersecurity firm and started my own environmental data consultancy, helping communities identify and document potential contamination from industrial sources. The irony wasn't lost on me, using skills I had developed to expose my family's crimes to prevent similar scenarios elsewhere. On a crisp October morning, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read simply, "We need to talk." It was from Emma. We hadn't spoken since the trial. The last I'd heard, she had moved to Colorado with her children after her divorce was finalized, according to Aunt Rebecca, who still kept tabs on the family through distant connections. "I'll be in town next weekend," the email read. "The children want to meet their uncle, if you're willing." I stared at the screen for a long time, conflicting emotions washing over me. I had made peace with losing my family. I had convinced myself I was better off without the weight of their expectations and secrets. But Emma's children, my niece and nephew, were innocent in all this. They hadn't chosen their grandfather or great-grandfather, they hadn't participated in the cover-up. I replied with the address of a cafe near my apartment and a time that worked. When the day arrived, I got there early, choosing a corner table with a view of the entrance. I recognized Emma immediately when she walked in, though she had changed considerably. Gone was the polished society wife with the perfect hair and designer clothes. This Emma wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair cut short in a practical bob. Behind her trailed two children, Emma, now 10, and James, 8. "Uncle Michael?" Emma asked cautiously as they approached the table. I nodded, smiling despite